Hello, today we're going to be talking about emerging threats to food security. Uh, we will be looking at a variety of issues, by no means all of them. And I'll start out by looking at what is something we've already alluded to when we talked about demography. It's the fact that the world's population is growing extremely fast still. That best modeling shows about 9.7 billion people by 2050. And it's not only the number of people, but assuming that incomes can continue to rise around the world, as we have a growing middle class in the world, uh, it's going to translate into a lot more. So all that additional animal protein will require a lot more grain in order to produce that livestock. Additionally, as we try to decarbonize our economy, some of the stubborn areas that will be hard to electrify might include airplanes and possibly ships. And the only way to decarbonize those are with biofuels. And that will put some pressure on farmland, as some land will have to be taken out of agricultural production and put into biofuel production. Now, so many people who look at what needs to be done say that using 2010 as a base, food production has to double between 2010 and 2050. Um, and the bad news is we've not been keeping up with the required 2.2 growth rate that we need in order to meet food demands in 2050. We're falling short. Um, Now, what happens if we don't find ways to intensify production? If we continue to see slow growths in yields, it's going to push people into remaining forest areas. It's going to increase pressure on already stressed fisheries, and from both there'll be negative feedbacks. Um, this will also, of course, have far-reaching impacts on ecosystems, biodiversity, and our climate system if we convert more forest area to agricultural area. Part of the pressure also comes from existing amounts of landless people living in rural areas. Uh, they have two difficult choices, whether to move to a city or whether to live a really poor life working on the fields of others. In countries where there's a third choice, many take this third choice, which is moving into marginal forest land in places like Amazonia and Malaysia, Indonesia, parts of Africa. People have been cutting down tropical rainforests with have very poor soils, but desperate people at least look for some place to call their own and where they can farm. Right. After population, the granddaddy of them all in terms of threats is climate change. Won't go much into climate change, but I advise you, if you're not sure about the science, to look into it. It's also taught in ANAC 202, but climate change is a major threat to food security for a wide number of reasons. It's not only that things are going to get warmer, but rainfall patterns are set to change. It's not only the amount of rain, but as you put more energy into the system, you're going to have more intense rainfall. So it's not unlikely that a region, let's say North Carolina, might go through longer episodes of drought, followed by heavy rainfall, but heavy rainfall that falls during short periods and has a negative impact of compacting the soil, harming crops through flooding. So this is one of the problems with climate change. There are a whole bunch of, you know, predictability is the friend of the farmer. Unpredictability is the enemy of farming. And climate change is just going to make it so much harder to do outdoor farming. Uh, from droughts to excessive precipitation to too much heat. We'll see how too much heat can especially affect grains, and lots of new crop diseases and pests. Here's how, without adaptation, if we were to continue with our existing technology, uh, this is what will happen to food production in 2050. You can see some of the lower income areas of the world, especially the Middle East, Africa, are going to be hit with decreased food production. But on top of that, some areas that are very important now for meeting global food needs, like the United States, Australia has often been a big exporter of grains. Argentina are also going to see lower yields. The few places that can expect things to get better are in northern latitudes. Problem with these areas is they're not going to offset a decreased production in areas that were highly productive grasslands. These are areas that currently are boreal forest, tundra. These soils are not high quality soils. They're very acidic. They will not equal what's being harmed in some of the more currently temperate areas. You can see there's a huge projection in drought frequency. This also the negative feedback here is it puts more stress on water resources, groundwater, fossil groundwater, surface water. So it's going to complicate the agriculture-water relationship. I mentioned that grains and climate change have a scary relationship, and we're seeing it already in Asia, places like Thailand, parts of India. As nighttime temperatures go up, when key grains like rice and wheat are flowering, this decreases the yield. It can actually, if temperatures go too high, it can decrease the yield to zero. And what you see is a very impressive, almost linear relationship at times for the amount of crop production lost. For every degree Celsius, the temperature rises when crops are flowering, especially once you start to get over 30 Celsius, you start to see for each degree a staggering loss of yield. And as I mentioned, scientists are already seeing this pattern occasionally in Thailand, India, other parts of Asia. So this will really make it much more difficult to feed the world's population if we start to see lowering yields being lowered by warmer temperatures. So diseases. Diseases have what's called a natural nidus. It's their environment, the ecosystem they can live in naturally. And part of what constitutes the natural nidus of a disease agent is temperature. And as things are getting warmer, we can expect that human and crop diseases that currently exist only in warmer places are going to start to move higher in latitude and also higher in altitude. A good example that's already been documented is the potato blight that caused the Irish potato famine, is native to the Andean region. It has a certain temperature threshold, and the areas that are colder than what it can tolerate are the traditional potato belt of the Andes. What's been found in the last few decades is that the disease has been moving up in altitude. Fortunately, there has been response to breed potatoes that are more resistant to the blight. But this gives you an example of the kind of challenges we're going to be facing from warmer temperatures. Climate change makes it harder to control pests and reduce our dependency on chemical pesticides. There are a whole bunch of things that will favor pests. From milder winter means more of the first generation will survive, or the last generation of the previous year becomes the first generation of the next year. Pests can spread just like diseases to higher altitudes and latitudes. It's going to also increase resistance to insecticides. There'll be more generations that are born. This is going to be a big problem as we try to intensify agriculture and make it more environmentally sustainable. We'll be fighting against the pressure that's also coming from climate change and how it's making pests even more difficult to control. Okay, another big problem with agriculture is incredible soil mismanagement. We have often emphasized short-term production over long-term sustainability. We reward, actually during after the Depression and the Dust Bowl, for a while we rewarded farmers for being good soil stewards, but that went away in the 70s when Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, basically told farmers to plow from one end of their field to the other, and most of the programs that had been put in place following the Dust Bowl to preserve soil were been scrapped in the name of maximizing agricultural production on a given unit of land. You can see soil erosion is incredibly high in the US, especially in some of our most important grain regions. We've been basically, through poor soil management, rain and wind have been carrying away large amounts of soil. Large amounts of the sediment eventually washes into the Mississippi River and goes downriver. This is a long-term threat to our ability to produce food. Um, there's a limit to how much food we're ever going to be able to produce indoors. We're always going to depend on soil to a large degree, at least in the foreseeable future, for the bulk of our calories. So good soil management is critical, and rethinking policies and how we subsidize farms to encourage farmers again to be good soil stewards is really important. Not to mention that being a good soil steward helps lock carbon up into the soil, and it helps make farmers part of the solution to climate change rather than part of the problem. You can see poor soil management practices are not unique to the US. They are widespread, they are global. This year, we've experienced the African dust phenomena. You can see this area in Africa. The orange belt just below the Sahara is the Sahel region we've talked about already when we've talked about Mali. A combination of changing rainfall patterns and poor soil management have been producing more desertification, and that's meant enormous amounts of dust. And we experienced that now all over the US, huge African dust storms reaching across the Atlantic and arriving in the US. And that is in large part courtesy of very poor soil management practices. But wherever you look, wherever you see major food producing regions in the world, you can see that there's very poor soil management that has been going on. Another important thing is that agriculture is the neglected sector of economic development. After World War II, a new field developed, economic development. Prior to World War II, most of what we call low-income countries today were colonies of Europe, and one could go into a discussion on how relationships between colonies and the mother countries kept colonies poor. After gaining independence, this problem of how to bring about economic development bubbled up into a big economic concern, and hence the field of economic development was born in the 1950s. What people who studied economic development looked at were factors that caused takeoff. They saw a growing economy, metaphorically like an airplane taking off, that you go down a runway, and if you have the factors right, this will lead to growth and an airplane taking up, like an airplane taking off, and your economy will start to grow and grow. And part of the conventional wisdom around takeoff was that was industrial growth, urban industrial growth, that were important elements of takeoff, that agriculture was a backward element of the economy, that it couldn't contribute much. So agriculture in low-income countries has been extremely neglected. Often when groups like the World Bank, the IMF went in and tried to steer governments towards growth, they would encourage governments to pull investment out of rural areas and concentrate it in cities and building industry in and around cities. As a result, agricultural R&D has really been neglected around the world, given all the challenges that especially sub-Saharan Africa will face. It's a real lack of investment for so many countries. Uh, Agricultural and R&D has to increase really all over the world. The only country that has really done a great job of increasing investment in agricultural R&D lately has been China. The Netherlands always, although it's a very small country, also invests a lot in agricultural R&D. So to some degree, you can see the future of food will be made in China, and to a lesser degree, the Netherlands, the US, and Germany. Brazil, perhaps too, although Brazil had its act more together in the previous decade than now. But problem is that China, the Netherlands pay more attention to domestic food production than they do to food production in places like sub-Saharan Africa, which is why there's a need for these countries to step up. I will say that there are some countries now that have kind of bucked conventional wisdom. Ghana has actually been able to boost economic growth by doing what was considered unthinkable a short time ago, by actually investing a lot in agriculture. So Ghana has gotten very good results out of that. We'll be talking about Vietnam in a coming lecture. Vietnam is another great example of a country that has looked into boosting the agricultural sector. Mozambique is currently embarked on a similar experiment. So that's good news that countries are beginning to buck the conventional wisdom and see the importance of investing in the agricultural sector. So Africa, I keep coming back to Africa. It's really important to boost yields there. Africa is the one place where the Green Revolution and Green Revolution package has not even come close to reaching its full potential. Many subsistence farmers in Africa seldom even have access to things like fertilizer. But then as we think about moving ahead to new technologies, Africa has enormous potential to boost food production, but it's going to require resources for that to happen. And that's critical. That's, Africa and South Asia, two places when we think about the future of food security that are the most concerning, along then with North Africa and the Middle East. Okay, an important problem also for agriculture is that it's very dependent on water. Most of the water we use actually goes into agricultural production, and you can see the prediction is that by 2040, increased areas of the world are going to be water stressed, and that's concerning because if you look at part in Northern Africa, Middle East, South Asia, China, these are areas with large populations, and in some cases, like North Africa and the Middle East, these are populations that are still growing. The United States is concerning because we are an important outlet. We export a lot of food, so decreased production in the United States has to be made up somewhere else, and it's hard to see where that's going to happen. So why is water stress becoming such a problem? Well, we have increased demand for water because of population growth, everything from cities requiring more water, but also more water being used to grow crops. And then also water is used in the industrial sector. Energy consumes some amount of water also. A lot of, like when we burn fossil fuels or nuclear plants, they're basically, we're boiling water to turn a turbine. Some of that water comes back into the environment, some is released as steam, but then you have issues of thermal pollution when the water is dumped back into the environment at too hot a temperature. Poor price signals are very important. We and this is where the quandary comes in. It's important to have water affordable, because otherwise there'll be a big problem for low-income people. You don't want low-income people spending 40% of their income on water. But also low prices leads to waste, leads to irrigating golf courses and lawns. The United States, green grass lawns are our #1 irrigated crop. An area approximately the size of Florida is dedicated in the US just to green grass lawns. Irrigation systems also in most of the world continue to rely on primitive technology, like this picture that's flood irrigation. And there's little price incentive on farmers to modernize their irrigation practices. You all are familiar with the water crises that have been rolling California. Farmers in California still, not everywhere, but a lot of farmers use water incredibly inefficient because water right situations there, and the idea that this water is theirs and it's their right to use the water the way they want. And of course, it's a lot cheaper to do flood irrigation than drip irrigation. Also, a threat to water is rising pollution levels from industry or agriculture. Even if that water goes back into the system, it can be so polluted that it's not really usable for anything. And seeing some of that with water in the Southwest that gets so contaminated, there's really no use for it. Finally, decreasing supply of water because of changing rainfall patterns, depletion of aquifers, especially fossil water like the Ogallala Aquifer. Another big problem is disappearance of glaciers, declining snowpack. This is reducing the amount of surface water. And in terms of reducing the amount of surface water, I recommend that you look at a map from the 1960s of Africa and Central Asia. You'll see a body of water in Africa called Lake Chad, and one in Central Asia called the Aral Sea. Both of those are now blips on current maps because they've largely disappeared. You can see the problem of fresh water availability per person, and then you think about the impact that agriculture has, because agriculture worldwide consumes 70% of the water we use. So this picture of lack of availability of water per person in many areas, especially in the Middle East, North Africa, but also in South Asia, people are seeing severe water stress, and agriculture is a major contributor to that. And you can see evolution of where water goes, the difference between withdrawal and consumption. Industry tends to withdraw but consume not a lot of what they withdraw, they put back a lot. You can see again that growing amount of cropland in the world is now facing water stresses, and this graph will show you by some key crops what percentage of the world that's planted. And for example, cotton is facing water stress, so 57% of the world's cotton, wheat 43%. So this is a problem that can't be ignored in the long term. It's kind of on the back bench. People who work in the field of agriculture know this is a big problem, but it's not one that's risen to high enough level of concern yet at the policy level. Okay, I want to look at another issue, which is fertilizers. So plants need a bunch of nutrients and micronutrients, and some micronutrients are really important, but the big three that we really would see crashing crop yields if we didn't have fertilizer for are nitrogen. And nitrogen we can produce industrially, but it requires a good amount of natural gas to do it. But then there are the other two of the three, phosphorus and potassium, we cannot produce through industrial processes. We have to extract them from the earth. And unfortunately, neither is abundant, and the supply of phosphate rock is especially limited. So I'll focus on phosphate rock, but don't take potassium for granted either. The supply there is not great. So why do we need phosphorus? It's essential for producing good flowering in plants. You have vegetable garden, you want more fruit, or you just have a flower bed. The best thing you can do if you're going to apply fertilizer is to apply something high in phosphorus. Basically, we would have, it'd be impossible for us to grow large amounts of crops without inputting extra phosphorus. Same thing with potassium. I won't go through all of these. You can look at it if you want to know what potassium is good for. But I want to look now at the problem with phosphorus. So phosphorus comes from phosphate rock, and you can see historically we've been getting more and more of our phosphorus from phosphate rock. You can get some from manure. Bat guano was once a popular way to get, but we've mined most of the bat guano in places like Peru, where there was once a lot of guano. That supply is pretty much gone. So bat and bird droppings produce guano. Now, problem with phosphate rock is not that it's very limited, but also it's rather limited in distribution. One country, Morocco, Western Sahara are different, but Morocco has its hooks into Western Sahara, controls 85% of the world's phosphate supply. Not to say anything negative about Morocco, because anybody with a stranglehold on such an important global resource will try to maximize the value they get out of that. We've seen that, how cartel organized around oil to withhold supply to keep prices high. At some point, you can imagine that Morocco is going to act as a price setter and demand a price, highest price the market can withstand for its phosphate. So that's one issue. Just running out of phosphate is another issue. And so you can see some people think, we're going to start seeing peak phosphorus by 2030, 2035. After that, the supplies will begin to decline. Most of it will be in Morocco. We'll see declining production, and we'll see prices rising rapidly. This is a big threat to food production in the future. It also is a big push for us to develop new technologies to increase the amount of phosphorus coming out of human excreta, to find economical ways to recycle phosphorus out of the human waste stream. At some point, we'll be pushed and we'll have to do so. So it's a good thing to start working on those technologies. And in the Netherlands, they are doing that. They've actually had quite a bit of success already. Right, another theme, and this is a broad and major theme, is that we depend on the ocean still for a lot of food, especially protein, and we're really doing a good job of mucking up the oceans. There's one hypothesis called the primordial ocean hypothesis, which says that we're not harming all organisms. We're actually, by making the ocean more polluted, dirtier, we're favoring ancient organisms that go back maybe all the way to the Permian era. Things like jellyfish seem to be doing quite well in this new environment that we're manufacturing in our marine systems. So one of the big pressures on the ocean is wild catch. Today we have more boats with better technology, and that is a big problem. The ocean's ability to produce fish is not finite, and when you combine more boats chasing fewer fish with ever better technology, that's a big problem. Aquaculture is trying to fill some of the void. But aquaculture is still in its early stages, and a lot of it is also very unsustainable. Uh, Shrimp farming is a good example of a very unsustainable type of aquaculture. So hopefully we can develop more sustainable forms of aquaculture in the future, but that is something we need a lot of work on. So you can see what's been happening with global overfishing. This is what Garrett Hardin would call a tragedy of the commons. While countries control their nearshore environments, especially deeper water, this is a common area where there's no control over fishing, and that's problematic. But even the nearshore environments, very few countries have done a good job protecting fisheries. The well-managed fisheries in the world are still a rarity. Perhaps this is one area the United States has been better than most. We have certain fisheries like the lobster fishery in Maine that is a rare example of a well-managed fishery. There's also several on the West Coast. Some cases, California, which was a bit late to the game after fisheries collapsed, like abalone fisheries, have been trying to restore through good practices, but might be too little too late. And you can see most of the fish is coming from industrial fishing. Artisanal fishing refers to subsistence fishing, somebody out in Asia with a small boat, doing hook and line fishing or maybe spear fishing. Then you have subsistence fishing too. Artisanal fishing is still pointed at selling in the market, but technology is not that great, so its threat is nothing compared to industrial fishing, which has ways of locating fish populations, and then also sometimes has technology like bottom trawling, which not only catches large number of fish, but also can harm the environment, so the fish population takes longer to recover. Bycatch discards is also another big problem, where a lot of fish that are caught in nets are not what have no market value and are just thrown back in the water dead. So here's an example of decline in major Atlantic fish. We've seen in salmon from 1950 to 2010, an almost 80% decline in the population. In cod, it's hard to believe that cod was once cheap and it was such an abundant fish. We have now 10% of what we had in 1970, or less than that. This is 2010 data. And some fisheries off the North Atlantic coast of North America have been closed for long periods of time and are showing no sign of recovering. Tuna, depending on the species, it's a lot worse for Atlantic bluefin tuna, but in general, tuna populations are now less than 30% of what they were in 1950s. So again, 2000 data, the trend is going downward. It's especially true for Atlantic bluefin. The trend is even much worse than this. Now, here's the case for developing and implementing sustainable fisheries. A huge percentage of the population today still rely on fish for important primary source of protein. That's we have 7.5 billion people today, 3 billion. That's a huge number of people. Huge employment opportunities. It's a big contributor to economic development. And if we were to manage our fishing stock more sustainably, it would produce all-around benefits: more employment, more economic growth, more protein for people to eat. So we're paying a big price for our inability or neglect to manage our fisheries better. I just want to point out something that few people think about, but often, the idea is, you want to keep the big ones and throw the little ones back in so they can have time to grow and reproduce. Problem with fish is that large sizes pay in terms of reproduction. Large fish produce enormous numbers more of eggs than smaller fish. So you can see this example with red snapper, that today's average size red snapper is about a pound. Uh, and when you compare that to the red snapper of 1962, that was 21 pounds and much older, twice the length of today's red snapper, you can see the difference in reproduction potential. For the today's red snapper, you have about 150,000 eggs produced by a female. You can see that number used to be almost, wow, more than 20 times greater. So that really takes a hit in your population when you harm reproduction that much. We should be throwing in some of the big fish, but of course, that's contrary to the interest of fishermen in the short term. So overfishing is not the only major threat to the productivity of our marine environments. We've got enormous problems of pollution, chemical pollution, bio, we've got microplastics, and this is all undermining the productivity of the ocean, especially microplastics now. Many of you have heard about the gyre. We're finding gyres in all our oceans. In the middle of the Pacific, there's a gyre of plastic that's about the size of Texas. Doesn't look like it does in this picture. It's mostly now tiny bits of plastic that you could be in the middle of the gyre, and unless you put a net in the water, you'd have no idea because the pieces of plastic are so small. We've got nutrient runoff and damage to coastal ecosystems because of poor soil management. Chemicals, sediment is being carried from river systems into our coastal ecosystems, and this is creating enormous damage. One of those things that it does is that it creates hypoxia and eutrophication, where oxygen content in water goes down. As a result, all those agricultural chemicals help nourish algae. When that algae dies and the oxygen is used by the bacteria to break down algae, that's one of the things that causes hypoxia, a lack of oxygen. It's very unfortunate because it's the near-shore environments where this is happening that are the critical nurseries for most of our seafood. So this is very unfortunate. Again, a problem of poor soil management. You can see that the state of coastal ecosystems in the world does not look good. And I'm wondering why around South Asia, you just see one dot. I'm assuming that's probably from lack of data, because the nutrients coming off the rivers in this part of the world are pretty extensive. Closer up of the damage in the Gulf of Mexico, which is largely courtesy of Midwestern farmers. Then we also have the destruction of nearshore environments like coral reefs, wetlands, especially marshes, mangroves, grass beds. Again, these are all ecosystems that produce a lot of seafood on their own, but are also doubly important in some cases like mangroves, grass beds, wetlands as nurseries for young fish. Coral reefs are incredibly productive on their own. You get a lot of protein. People in the tropics who live in coastal environments depend on coral reefs for a lot of their protein. And the causes of the demise of coral reefs are vast. Warmer water, though attributable to climate change, is probably the biggest. Also, climate change, too much carbon is also contributing to ocean acidification. But if you know someone who doubts that humans are causing harm to the world, coral reefs are really the canary in the coal mine. In the last 50 years, we've really seen the decimation of most of the world's coral reefs, beginning in places like the Caribbean, but now even in places, some of the most important reefs in the world, like the Great Barrier Reef, reefs off places like Seychelles. In the Indo-Pacific region, we've seen incredible devastation. Also, how we fish makes a difference. In Southeast Asia, blast fishing is very popular, and people who often don't live in the nearby area, it's like roaming bands of fishermen will move from one area to the next. They'll fish it out using blast fishing. Once they've reduced the area to rubble in one place, they move on. Because they don't live nearby, they have no real stake in sustainability of that reef. And this has been a huge problem in places like the Philippines and Indonesia. So as I mentioned, we're destroying reefs for short-term profit of a few, whereas in coastal tropical regions, it's estimated that coral reefs are providing half the protein people are consuming. Again, this is a tragedy of how we're dealing with coral reefs. Wetlands, again, I mentioned wetlands, important nursery for most of our seafood. And you can see the level of loss of wetlands. We have less now than 20% of what we had 300 years ago. And there does not seem to be any sign that the world is getting its act together to protect and restore wetlands. Here are some of the main causes driving wetland loss. I won't go over these, you can read them. Ocean acidification, I mentioned already, too much carbon dioxide. A lot of people who think climate change shouldn't be a problem, that we could fertilize the ocean so that it can absorb more CO2. That CO2 eventually will be released into the water, and the problem is CO2 is a weak acid, and without getting into the chemistry, it makes it harder for organisms that lay down a shell to do so. So it affects anything from shellfish to coral reefs, all depend on laying down carbon calcium shells. But it also, more concerningly, affects plankton. So when you start to talk about how more acidic ocean can threaten our ability to harvest from the ocean by undermining the ability of a lot of plankton to grow, we're really hitting at the base of the food chain, and this can turn out to be incredibly disruptive. So this is a problem to pay more attention to, and to be skeptical when people talk about having the oceans absorb more CO2. Another issue has been the collapse of freshwater fisheries. This is something that actually you could witness earlier in the US. If you go back 100 years, the Great Lakes was once the world's greatest freshwater fishery. Today, it's mostly just for recreational fishing. We've done enormous damage to the Great Lakes through pollution and also through the introduction of invasive species like the lamprey. Now, so this graph just shows from 1970 to 2010, and it shows the collapse around the world. So as I mentioned, we already saw a lot of damage before 1970, so it's an arbitrary baseline. But what we're seeing today is important rivers like the Amazon River Basin, the Congo, the Mekong. We're seeing a lot of those fish stocks begin to collapse, and especially the stock of very large fish has also been taking a beating. Okay, now the challenge of securing our food supply is that we have to find a way to feed more people using less land and do that in a way that doesn't harm the environment. So we have a growing gap of what we need to produce. We need to also think on this, we didn't even get into food resiliency. We need to think about technologies that will not only allow us to increase food, but will also allow our food supply to become more resilient. So this is a really interesting area from perspective of entrepreneurship. There are a lot of things that can be done here that would make someone feel good about themselves while also making money on something that's very important to the world's future. And I want to emphasize this lectures only skim the surface with regards to threats to food security. While I alluded to some of these, I didn't go into any detail. So desertification is not just happening in the Sahel region, it's happening all around the world. By now, most people are familiar with the pollinator crisis. We have the salinization of soils still happening in many places that's rendering soils a lot less suitable for the production of grains and any kind of crop. A lot of good farmland is being lost to human settlement as cities and towns sprawl into what was farmland. We have loss of biodiversity that will limit the potential of biotechnology. Talked a little bit about ocean plastics, its impact on biodiversity still being studied, and not just on biodiversity, but also on marine organism populations. And one could go on with other problems. Here are some questions for you to consider before the next class. And thank you for listening to this lecture, and look forward to discussing these questions with you in our next class.